Europe has long been the leader on climate regulation, and many of the pressures felt by businesses in the United States come from multinational corporations that have a presence in Europe and elsewhere. It is worth remembering that Europe is more than the European Union. There are countries outside of that agreement that have their own regulations, and even countries within that union that have regulations that go beyond the EU. The degree with which Europe is ahead of every other location in regulation and the diversity of regulatory environments means that it isn't possible to have a comprehensive yet short introduction. But I'll introduce a couple of the big things to pay attention to. Let's start with the EU and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD. It replaces a previous regulation known as the NFRD and will require covered companies to report 2024's emissions in 2025. Companies that make over 40 million euro or have 20 million euros on their balance sheet or have over 250 employees will most likely have to report under this law. Specifically, they will need to report questions meeting the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, or TCFD's precepts, a full scope emissions report and forecast, detailed energy consumption numbers, carbon intensity scores, physical risks, exposure to the use of fossil fuels, and absolute carbon emissions reduction targets for both 2030 and 2050. The key takeaway here is if you do business with almost anybody in the EU, they will likely need you to report your footprint soon. Or if you are a covered business within the EU zone, this is a significant regulatory requirement and you should begin working immediately with a reputable company like Acclimate to prepare these reports by the end of 2024. The second regulation to pay attention to in the European Union is the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, or the SFDR. This regulation is designed to provide people with the climate impacts of their investment decisions and is already in effect. There are different levels of disclosure depending upon the investment product being offered, but at a minimum, a company that provides investment products must share a set of sustainability and ESG risks, including those around climate impact. The key takeaways here are, if you manage investments in Europe, you should already be complying with this law. And if you are seeking or have received investment from individuals or organizations located within Europe, you should expect to be reporting your climate footprint as part of the terms of investment. Moving to the United Kingdom, many of the regulations that existed in a pre-Brexit world have been replaced post-Brexit with UK-specific regs. The first to cover is the Sustainability Disclosure Requirement, or SDR. Still going through development, it is expected to be finalized in 2024 and looks similar to the EU's SFDR. It requires investment firms of all sizes and companies with public shares listed within the UK to provide labeling, customer-facing disclosures, and controls to prevent greenwashing. The key takeaway here is that investment managers and public companies within the UK should be preparing for this immediately. Companies seeking or receiving investments from investment managers within the UK should also expect to report their climate footprint. The last major climate regulation we'll talk about is the United Kingdom's Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting, or SECR. Companies with greater than 250 employees or over £36 million in revenue, or £18 million on the balance sheet, will likely be required to disclose their total energy consumption and their Scope 1 and 2 emissions. They will need to include an intensity ratio, such as emissions per pound of revenue, and share plans about energy efficiency. Public companies will also be required to disclose their global operations. The key takeaway is that mid-sized companies within the United Kingdom need to report their Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and the energy used to create those emissions. Again, there are other regulations within Europe, and this is not meant to be in an exhaustive list, but an introduction into the regulatory environment and the pressures around climate disclosures. Consult local resources for the most current information about your company's reporting requirements.